My parents installed cameras in every room for our protection, until I found out why they really did it. I found the receipt in Dad's desk drawer while looking for printer paper at 11:43 p.m. on a Thursday. Not just any receipt, a payment confirmation from a website called privatecapture.net for $8,340 deposited on the 15th of last month. The description read, Content Package 3B, Premium Residential Collection. My hands went numb holding that paper because I recognized the date. That was 3 days after Mom had filmed me getting dressed for homecoming, claiming the bedroom camera had malfunctioned and she needed to document it wasn't working properly. I'd believed her because I'd believed everything they told me about the cameras for the past 2 years. They were for our safety after the neighborhood break-ins. They were to make sure we were okay when they traveled for work. They were normal, just modern parenting in a dangerous world. The receipt suggested something very different. I took a photo of it with shaking hands, put it back exactly where I found it, and went to my room where I stared at the camera mounted in the corner near my ceiling, its small red light blinking steadily. That camera had watched me sleep, change clothes, cry over breakups, everything. And someone had paid my parents $8,340 for footage. I didn't sleep that night. We'd lived in our house on Maple Ridge Drive for 6 years, a quiet suburb outside Portland where nothing interesting ever happened until the summer I turned 14. That's when the Kowalski family 3 houses down got robbed while they were at their lake house. Then the Abbotts across the street had someone break in during a dinner party and steal jewelry from their bedroom. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with panic and speculation about organized crime rings targeting our area. My parents, Gerald and Vanessa Burke, had always been safety conscious, but this sent them into overdrive. Dad worked in IT security for a financial services company, and Mom was a child psychologist with her own practice. They were educated, respected, the kind of parents other parents envied. When they announced we'd be installing a comprehensive security system, including interior cameras, it seemed reasonable given the circumstances. They explained it at dinner one Wednesday in July, both of them looking serious but caring. They said the cameras would only be in common areas and our bedrooms, not bathrooms. They said we could turn them off when we wanted privacy, though they hoped we'd keep them on so they could check on us when they traveled for conferences. They said other families in the neighborhood were doing the same thing. My younger brother Austin was 11 and thought it was cool, like living in a spy movie. I was 14 and uncomfortable but didn't want to seem paranoid or ungrateful when they were just trying to keep us safe. The installation happened over a weekend. A guy named Rick from Secure Home Solutions spent 2 days running cables and mounting cameras. 6 total: living room, kitchen, Austin's bedroom, my bedroom, the hallway upstairs, and Dad's home office. Rick explained they were high definition with night vision and motion detection. The footage stored on a local server in Dad's office with cloud backup. My parents could access the feeds from their phones using an app. Rick made a point of showing us the privacy features, how we could disable cameras from a control panel in the hallway. Mom smiled and said she hoped we'd never need to use that function but wanted us to know it existed. That detail made me feel better. They were giving us control. They weren't trying to trap us. They were just being protective parents in a scary world. I went back to my room and looked at the camera mounted above my bookshelf, angled to capture most of the room, including my bed and desk. The red light blinked. I waved at it stupidly. Dad's voice came through my phone a moment later. A text. "I can see you. Love you, kiddo." I texted back a heart emoji and thought nothing more of it. That was 2 years ago. I'd gotten used to the cameras the way you get used to anything. They became invisible parts of the room, ambient presence I stopped noticing. The first strange thing I noticed was Mom's phone calls. She'd always taken patient calls in her office with the door closed, maintaining confidentiality. But about 6 months after the cameras went in, I started hearing her on calls in the kitchen where the camera had a perfect view. She'd speak in this carefully modulated voice about family situations and child behaviors, and I assumed she was consulting with other therapists or giving phone sessions. Except one time I walked in during a call and she switched to talking about grocery shopping mid-sentence. When she hung up, she was flustered in a way that didn't match discussing groceries. I asked if everything was okay and she laughed it off, saying she'd gotten confused about which call she was on. It seemed plausible. She was busy. But something about her expression stayed with me, a tightness around her eyes that suggested I'd interrupted something I wasn't supposed to witness. I told myself I was reading too much into an awkward moment. Parents were allowed to be flustered. The second strange thing was Dad's overnight trips to Seattle increasing. He'd always traveled occasionally for work, but suddenly he was going twice a month, sometimes more. Mom explained his company was expanding operations and needed his expertise for the setup. She said it was temporary, probably just 6 months until the new office was established. That made sense, except the trips kept extending beyond 6 months. When I asked Dad about it, he'd get vague, saying corporate projects always took longer than planned. He'd ruffle my hair and change the subject. After a year of frequent trips, I mentioned to Mom that it seemed like a lot. She got defensive immediately, asking if I didn't trust my father, if I thought he was lying about work. Her reaction was so disproportionate that I backed off and apologized. I didn't think he was lying. I just thought it was a lot of travel. But her defensiveness planted a seed of doubt I tried to ignore. The third strange thing was money. Not that we were struggling, but that we suddenly had more. New cars for both parents within 3 months of each other. A complete kitchen renovation. Mom's new jewelry. Dad's expensive watch collection. Austin got a gaming setup that cost thousands. I got a laptop upgrade I hadn't asked for. When I mentioned to Mom that we seemed to be doing really well financially, she smiled and said Dad had gotten a significant raise and bonus for his work on the Seattle project. She said they'd been smart with investments and it was paying off. They wanted to enjoy the fruits of their labor and give us nice things. It sounded reasonable, except I'd overheard Dad on a call months earlier complaining about his salary being stagnant. I'd assumed he'd been negotiating for a raise, but the timeline seemed too convenient. The money had started flowing right around the time his Seattle trips increased. I pushed the thought away because what was I suggesting? That my parents were doing something illegal or unethical? They were a child psychologist and an IT security professional. They were upstanding citizens. The cameras blinked their red lights and recorded everything, and I walked past them dozens of times a day without really seeing them anymore, until the night I found that receipt. After discovering the payment confirmation, I started paying attention in ways I hadn't before. I noticed Dad checking his phone constantly when we were in camera range, his fingers moving across the screen with focused intensity. I noticed Mom positioning herself carefully in the kitchen, like she was aware of camera angles. I noticed both of them encouraging me and Austin to spend time in our rooms rather than the basement playroom that had no camera. They'd frame it as us needing quiet space for homework or rest, but the pattern was clear. They wanted us in camera range. I started testing the privacy disable function and discovered it didn't actually work. I'd press the button for my bedroom camera and the light would go off, suggesting it was disabled. But I'd set up my laptop to record my room and caught the camera lens still adjusting focus even with the light off. The disable function was cosmetic. The cameras never actually stopped recording. I didn't confront them because I didn't know what I was confronting them about. All I had was a receipt for something called Content Package 3B and a growing certainty that the cameras weren't what they claimed to be. I started researching privatecapture.net. The website was professional looking, claiming to be a platform for licensed security footage storage and analysis. But digging deeper into forums and tech blogs, I found references to it being a clearinghouse for voyeuristic content, a place where people could sell footage from hidden or disclosed cameras in private residences. The content was legal in a gray area because the people being filmed were family members in their own homes, and in our state, you could record anyone in your house without consent as long as it wasn't in bathrooms or changing rooms. The market existed for people who wanted to watch real families, real teenagers, real daily life. The intimacy of it was the selling point. Premium content meant higher resolution, longer clips, more vulnerable moments. I felt sick reading about it, but I needed to be sure before I accused my parents of selling footage of their own children to strangers online. I created a fake account on Private Capture using a VPN and started searching for our content. I didn't have to look long. Package 3B was listed under a seller account called Pacific Family, with preview thumbnails that showed our living room and kitchen from exact angles matching our cameras. The description promised authentic American family, 2 teens, natural daily activities, premium HD footage. The price was listed at $275 per monthly package, with individual clips available for $15 to $50 depending on content. I clicked on a preview video and watched grainy footage of me making breakfast 3 weeks ago, spreading peanut butter on toast while talking to Austin about his math homework. Mundane, innocent, being sold to strangers for entertainment or worse. I closed my laptop before I vomited. That night at dinner, I watched my parents with new eyes. Mom asked about my day in her therapist voice, empathetic and engaged. Dad talked about a server issue at work, frustrated but humorous. They seemed normal. They seemed like parents. But I knew what they were doing in the periphery, how they were monetizing their children's privacy while pretending to protect us. I wanted to scream at them, but I didn't have a plan yet. If I confronted them, they'd delete everything and deny it. I needed evidence an adult would take seriously, evidence that couldn't be dismissed as a teenager's misunderstanding. After dinner, I went to my room and started documenting. I took screenshots of the Private Capture website showing our footage for sale. I photographed the receipt I'd found. I started keeping detailed notes about my parents' behavior, their calls, their reactions when I questioned things. I researched legal statutes about filming minors and discovered that while filming your own kids in your house was legal, Selling that footage commercially without their consent could potentially constitute exploitation, especially if the footage included private moments like me changing clothes or Austin in his underwear playing video games. I needed help, but I didn't know who to trust. Teachers were mandatory reporters, but what would I report? My parents haven't hit me, they're just selling videos of me eating breakfast. That sounded absurd even in my own head. I decided to tell Austin. He was 13 now and deserved to know he was being watched, not for safety, but for profit. I found him in his room on a Friday afternoon, playing some online game with his friends through his headset. I waited until he finished his round and asked if we could talk privately. He pulled off his headset, looking annoyed at the interruption. I closed his door and sat on his bed, trying to figure out how to explain this without sounding insane. I started with a question. Had he noticed anything weird about Mom and Dad lately? Austin shrugged and said no, they were normal. I asked if he'd ever tried the camera disable function, and he looked confused, saying he never bothered because he didn't care about the cameras. He'd grown up with them. They were just there. I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots from private capture. I watched his expression change from confusion to disbelief to horror as he understood what he was seeing. His own bedroom, his own footage, for sale on the internet. He asked if I was sure it was real and not some elaborate prank. I showed him the receipt. I showed him my documentation. I told him about the disable function not working and the patterns I'd noticed. Austin got very quiet and very pale. He asked what we were going to do. I said I didn't know yet, but we needed to be careful and not let Mom and Dad know we knew. Austin nodded slowly, and I could see him processing it, his childhood conception of safety shattering. Before I left his room, he asked if this meant they never actually cared about protecting us. I didn't have an answer that wouldn't break him further, so I just hugged him and said we'd figure this out. The opportunity came unexpectedly. Mom mentioned at breakfast the following Monday that she and Dad would be attending a conference in San Francisco that weekend, leaving Friday afternoon and returning Sunday evening. They'd arranged for Mrs. Keller from next door to check on us, but we were old enough to manage for a couple days. Austin and I exchanged looks across the table. This was our chance to access Dad's office without interruption and find whatever else they were hiding. We just had to survive the week pretending everything was normal while the cameras watched our every move and our parents smiled and asked about homework and acted like they weren't betraying us every single day. I'd never been good at lying, but I discovered I could manage it when the alternative was continuing to live as content for strangers to purchase. Friday came slowly, and finally. Mom and Dad left at 3:30 p.m. with reassurances that Mrs. Keller had our emergency contacts, and we should call if we needed anything. Dad ruffled my hair and told me to be good. Mom hugged us both and said she loved us. I hugged her back and felt nothing but disgust underneath my smile. They drove away, and Austin and I watched from the living room window until their car disappeared around the corner. We went straight to Dad's office. The door was locked, but I'd learned to pick simple locks from YouTube videos, a skill I'd acquired thinking I might need it someday. Today was that day. The lock gave way after 2 minutes of fumbling, and we pushed into the office that we were rarely allowed to enter. Dad's desk was organized meticulously, folders labeled and stacked, his computer monitor dark. The server he'd mentioned during camera installation sat on a shelf, lights blinking to indicate active recording. I sat at his computer and tried his usual password. It didn't work. I tried variations. Nothing. Austin suggested trying Mom's birthday, and that worked on the third try, a small victory. The computer opened to his desktop, which was surprisingly clean, just a few folders and his email client. I opened the email and started searching for anything related to private capture or Pacific Family. I found a dedicated folder with hundreds of emails going back 18 months, communications with buyers, pricing negotiations, special requests for specific types of footage. My stomach turned as I read strangers asking for clips of the daughter doing homework in her room, or the son playing video games in pajamas. Dad responded professionally, providing samples and quotes, discussing camera angles and lighting quality. He wrote like he was selling software licenses, not footage of his children. One email thread detailed a buyer wanting footage of me getting ready for school, specifically the moments where I was choosing outfits and looking in the mirror. Dad had negotiated that up to $85 for a 5-minute clip. I'd been sold for $85. Austin was reading over my shoulder, and I heard him make a small sound of distress. I took screenshots of everything and uploaded them to a cloud drive Mom and Dad didn't know about. The server records were even worse. Dad had been meticulous about cataloging footage by room, time, and activity. Each clip was tagged with keywords: teen daughter studying, teen daughter phone call with friend, teen son gaming, teen son eating snacks. He'd created a database of our lives broken into purchasable moments. Some clips were marked premium with higher prices attached. I clicked on one marked premium, daughter, 14, bedroom, evening routine, and watched myself getting ready for bed 9 months ago, brushing my hair and changing into pajamas. The camera angle captured everything. I'd been completely unaware I was being watched for commercial purposes. The clip had sold for $120 and the buyer had left feedback. Excellent natural content, daughter very photogenic. I felt like my skin was trying to crawl off my body. Austin found folders of financial records showing deposits from private capture totaling over $40,000 in the past 18 months. That explained the new cars and renovations. They'd been funding their lifestyle by selling our privacy to strangers. I copied everything to my cloud drive, every email, every financial record, every piece of evidence that proved what they were doing. We had documentation, but I still didn't know what to do with it. Calling the police seemed extreme. What crime had they technically committed? Filming their kids in their own home was legal. Selling the footage existed in a legal gray area. I needed someone who could tell me if this was prosecutable or just ethically horrifying. I thought of Mrs. Patel, my guidance counselor at school. She was required to report abuse, but was this abuse? I didn't know. I decided to risk it. Monday morning, I went to her office and asked if we could talk privately. Mrs. Patel was in her late 40s with kind eyes and a reputation for actually listening to students instead of dismissing them. She closed her office door and gestured for me to sit. I asked if our conversation was confidential, and she explained that anything involving harm or danger to a minor had to be reported, but she'd work with me on how that reporting happened. I took a breath and told her everything. The cameras installed for safety, the footage being sold online, the receipts and emails I'd found, Austin being affected too. Mrs. Patel's expression shifted from concerned to horrified as I showed her the screenshots on my phone. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said this was absolutely reportable and likely illegal under exploitation laws. She said she needed to contact Child Protective Services and possibly law enforcement, but wanted my permission to do it in a way that protected me and Austin. She asked if I felt safe going home, and I said yes physically, but not in any other way. Mrs. Patel made calls while I sat in her office trying to process that this was really happening, that I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. Within 2 hours, a CPS investigator named Diana Forrester arrived at the school to interview me. Diana Forrester was a Black woman in her mid-30s who'd been with CPS for 8 years, specializing in cases of child exploitation. She had a calm, professional demeanor that made me feel like she'd heard worse things than what I was about to tell her. We sat in a private conference room and she recorded our conversation with my permission. I walked her through everything again, showing her all my documentation. Diana asked detailed questions about the camera installation, our parents' explanations, when I discovered the footage was being sold, what efforts I'd made to verify it. She examined the screenshots carefully and made notes. She asked if my parents had ever touched me inappropriately or made me do things for the camera, and I said no, they'd never been physically abusive in any way. This was purely surveillance and sale without our knowledge. Diana explained that Oregon law had specific statutes about commercial exploitation of minors and using children's likenesses for profit without consent. Even though my parents had legal right to film in their own home, selling that footage commercially likely violated exploitation laws. She said she'd be coordinating with law enforcement to investigate further, and that a detective from the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force would probably want to interview me. She asked if I was willing to cooperate with an investigation, and I said yes, absolutely. Diana said she'd be placing a temporary safety plan that would likely involve Austin and me staying with relatives while the investigation proceeded. She asked if we had family locally, and I mentioned my dad's sister, Aunt Rachel, who lived 30 minutes away. Diana said she'd contact her. The detective arrived at our house that evening. Detective James Whitlock from the Portland Police Bureau's Cybercrime Unit, 12 years investigating online exploitation cases. He was accompanied by Diana Forrester and another officer. My parents had come home early from their conference after Diana had called to inform them of the investigation. They sat on the couch in our living room looking shocked and betrayed, like we'd done something to them. The cameras were still recording. Detective Whitlock asked permission to search the premises and examine the computer server. Dad refused initially, demanding a warrant. Whitlock said he'd get one, but Dad could make this easier by cooperating. Mom finally convinced Dad to allow the search, probably hoping they could explain everything away as a misunderstanding. Whitlock and a computer forensics specialist began examining Dad's office while another officer interviewed Austin separately. I sat at the kitchen table with Diana while Whitlock's people worked. Mom kept trying to talk to me, asking why I'd gone to outside authorities instead of talking to them first. She used her therapist voice, suggesting I'd misunderstood something and we could clarify as a family. I didn't respond. Dad sat silently, his jaw clenched, watching the police process his office. After 2 hours, Whitlock emerged with several hard drives and a laptop in evidence bags. He asked my parents to come to the station for formal interviews. Dad asked if they needed lawyers, and Whitlock said that was their choice, but they should probably consult one. The next 48 hours were chaos. Austin and I stayed with Aunt Rachel, who was horrified when Diana explained why we'd been removed from the home. She kept asking how her brother could do something like this, how she'd never suspected. The news broke locally when a reporter caught wind of the police investigation. Local couple arrested for selling footage of their children online ran on the evening news. Mom and Dad had been arrested after their interviews when they'd admitted to selling the footage but claimed they didn't think it was illegal. They'd posted bail by morning and were on house arrest with ankle monitors. The story went viral regionally and then nationally. Child psychologist and IT professional monetized their own children's privacy. The internet exploded with outrage and disbelief. Mom's practice immediately suspended her pending investigation. Dad was put on administrative leave. Their faces were everywhere, attached to think pieces about privacy, exploitation, and the commercialization of family life. Former patients of Mom's came forward questioning whether she'd recorded their therapy sessions. Dad's employer launched an internal investigation into whether he'd used company resources for his private camera system. Everything unraveled publicly and spectacularly. Meanwhile, Austin and I tried to process our new reality in Aunt Rachel's guest room, watching our parents' downfall on the news like it was happening to strangers. The criminal charges came a week later. Both parents were charged with multiple counts of commercial exploitation of minors, invasion of privacy, and unlawful dissemination of intimate images. The district attorney, Margaret Thornhill, held a press conference explaining that while parents had broad rights to record their children, selling that footage commercially without consent violated state exploitation laws. She said this case represented a troubling intersection of technology and parental authority, one that required clear legal boundaries to protect children from being commodified by their own families. The possible sentences ranged from probation to 5 years in prison per count. Media coverage intensified. National news outlets picked up the story. My parents' lawyer, a man named Douglas Crane who specialized in white-collar criminal defense, argued that the laws were vague and his clients had believed they were operating legally. He painted them as misguided but not malicious, parents who'd made poor judgments but loved their children. The narrative didn't stick because the emails Detective Whitlock had found showed clear awareness that what they were doing was ethically questionable. One email from Dad to a buyer read, "Yes, the subjects are unaware of the commercial purpose. That's part of what makes the content authentic." That line got quoted everywhere, proof that they'd known we didn't know and had deliberately kept it from us. The preliminary hearing was held 6 weeks after the initial investigation. Austin and I didn't attend, but Diana Forrester testified about her investigation and the evidence she'd collected. Detective Whitlock presented the forensic analysis of Dad's server showing 18 months of systematic filming and selling. A digital forensics expert explained how the footage had been tagged, priced, and distributed through private capture. The defense tried to argue entrapment or selective prosecution, but the judge found sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. Trial was set for 4 months later. In the meantime, Mom and Dad were forbidden from contacting Austin and me directly. Communication had to go through attorneys or supervised visits with a social worker present. We had one such visit at Diana's office 2 months after the arrest. Mom cried and apologized, saying she'd never meant to hurt us and had convinced herself the footage was harmless. She said the money had been too good to resist and they'd rationalized it as just documenting our family life. Dad was less apologetic, defensive, and insisting they'd done nothing legally wrong even if we felt violated. He said we were overreacting and he couldn't believe we'd destroyed the family over this. His lack of remorse made it easier to walk away from that meeting knowing we'd made the right choice in exposing them. The social worker noted his concerning lack of accountability in her report to the court. The civil lawsuit came from an unexpected source. 7 families who'd discovered their footage on private capture sued the platform and everyone who'd sold content through it, including my parents. These were other families whose parents had set up cameras and sold footage, or in some cases, extended family members who'd hidden cameras during visits. The class action sought damages for violation of privacy and exploitation. My parents were named defendants along with dozens of others. Their lawyer tried to negotiate a settlement, but they had no money left after legal fees and bail. Our house was put up for sale to cover potential judgments. Austin and I were granted victim status in the lawsuit and would receive compensation if the plaintiffs won, though money couldn't undo what had been done to us. The trial revealed the scope of the operation. Private capture had facilitated sales of footage from over 200 families, generating millions in revenue. The platform's operators were facing federal charges. My parents were small players in a much larger network of people commodifying their children's lives. That context didn't excuse them, but it explained how they'd found the framework to do this. They hadn't invented the idea. They'd just adopted it enthusiastically once they discovered it existed. The criminal trial lasted 2 weeks. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: the server records, the emails, the financial deposits, testimony from buyers who'd purchased our footage. Austin and I both testified, describing the moment we'd discovered what was being done and how it had made us feel. I told the jury about watching myself on camera getting ready for bed, knowing strangers had paid to watch that intimate moment. I described the violation of trust when the people who were supposed to protect your privacy were the ones selling it. Austin cried on the stand, explaining how he couldn't sleep anymore without checking for cameras, how he'd been afraid to change clothes in his own room. The defense called character witnesses who testified that Mom and Dad were good people who'd made mistakes. They called an expert who argued the laws were too vague to establish clear criminal intent. It didn't matter. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts for both parents. Mom sobbed. Dad sat stone-faced. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, ordering pre-sentence reports and psychological evaluations. I felt relief and grief in equal measure watching them led out of the courtroom. These were still my parents. They'd still raised me and taken me to soccer practice and helped with homework. They'd also sold videos of me for profit and violated my privacy in ways I was still processing. Both things were true. Sentencing day arrived on a cold morning in November. The courtroom was packed with media and supporters on both sides. Victim advocates sat with Austin and me, while family members who still supported our parents sat on the other side. The pre-sentence reports recommended prison time given the systematic nature of the exploitation and the lack of remorse, particularly from Dad. Mom's report noted she'd shown more awareness of the harm caused and had been participating in therapy. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Sterling, reviewed all the materials and then addressed the defendants directly. She said that parents held positions of ultimate trust and authority over their children, and when that trust was violated for profit, it represented one of the most fundamental betrayals imaginable. She acknowledged that the laws in this area were evolving, but that didn't excuse deliberate exploitation. She noted the psychological harm caused to Austin and me, documented by our therapists. She said the sentences needed to reflect both punishment and deterrence. Mom received 18 months in prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Dad received 3 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Both would be required to register as offenders under Oregon's exploitation registry and would have restrictions on contact with minors, including their own children, until we turned 18. The sentences were less than the maximum, but more than the defense had hoped for. Mom collapsed, sobbing. Dad stared straight ahead. I felt nothing but exhausted relief that it was finally over. The aftermath stretched over months. Private capture was shut down by federal authorities and its operators faced decades in prison. The civil lawsuit settled with the platform's insurance, paying out millions to victims. Austin and I each received $75,000 in settlement funds that were placed in trust until we turned 18. Our house sold and the proceeds went to legal fees and restitution. Aunt Rachel became our legal guardian and we started the slow process of rebuilding our lives. Therapy helped, but some violations couldn't be fully healed. I still checked for cameras everywhere I went. Austin still struggled with trust issues. We both had to learn to exist in private spaces without the constant awareness of being watched. Mom served 14 months before being released to a halfway house. Dad served his full sentence. They sent letters through our guardian asking for reconciliation, but neither of us was ready. Maybe we'd never be ready. The people who'd sold our privacy for new cars and kitchen renovations had lost the right to access our emotional lives. They'd had their chance to be parents and they'd chosen profit instead. That choice had consequences they'd have to live with, just as Austin and I had to live with the consequences of their betrayal. The cameras were gone now, removed from every room and destroyed as evidence. The red lights no longer blinked in corners. We lived in Aunt Rachel's house with normal boundaries and privacy and respect for personal space. It felt strange at first, almost too quiet, too unseen. But slowly we adjusted to being just people again instead of content for sale. I'm 18 now, starting college with money from a settlement and scars from an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone. Austin is 15 and doing better than expected, focusing on school and friends and normal teenage things. We talk sometimes about what happened, but mostly we try to move forward. Our parents' crimes made national news and sparked legislative changes in Oregon and other states, clarifying laws around commercial exploitation of minors and parental surveillance rights. Mom was featured in a documentary about the case, expressing remorse and warning other parents about the ethical implications of monetizing children's lives. I didn't watch it. I didn't need her performative redemption. Dad never spoke publicly and disappeared after his release. I heard he moved to another state and changed his name. Good. Some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness or reconciliation. They just deserve to be survived and learned from. The cameras my parents installed weren't for our protection. They were for profit disguised as safety, exploitation hidden behind parental authority. By the time I discovered the truth, they'd made over $40,000 selling our privacy to strangers. By the time it ended, They'd lost everything that mattered: their freedom, their children, their reputation, their future. I didn't destroy my family by exposing them. They destroyed it themselves the moment they decided we were commodities instead of children. I just made sure everyone knew. The red lights are gone. I'm free. That's all that matters. If you made it this far, hit like and subscribe. You've earned it.